Hey, welcome back to Photography for the Rest of Us, a place for people who love photography. My name is Carrie, and today we're going to figure out why your photos are blurry. Oh, all right. So out of focus photos or blurry or soft photos is the bane of all of our existence as photographers, at least when they're not supposed to be that way, right? This is probably one of the top things I see in beginning photography groups or among my students. And honestly, I struggle with it sometimes too. So I wanted to put together a concise checklist for you guys of the things that I go through on my camera and my camera settings to figure out what the heck is happening with my images. All right, so we're gonna jump right into it. All right, first thing. Oh my gosh, I'm taking this epic picture, click, and it's not in focus, it's blurry, what's happening? First thing I'm gonna check is my autofocus actually turned on? Okay, now I know that sounds dumb, right? It sounds dumb, but the IT guys always ask if you have it turned on or plugged in on your computer when it's not working, right? This is the same thing. There is a switch on the side of your camera lens right here that can turn your autofocus on and off. It says either like AF and M or A and M or AF and MF, but basically it's autofocus or manual focus, right? And most lenses, not all, but most lenses have this switch. This switch occasionally likes switching itself to manual mode. Or maybe you were shooting in manual mode before and then you took it off and you forgot to switch it back. And now all of a sudden your camera is not focusing and you can't get anything in focus. So this is absolutely the first thing that I check, right? I know this switch exists and I need to make sure it is in autofocus because most of the time that's what I'm going to be shooting. I will also make note that your camera, some of them also have an autofocus or a manual focus option. And mine has a knob right down here that I can switch that with. So I need to check that both of those haven't gotten knocked or turned off or whatever. As a rule of thumb, I don't usually turn the manual focus on my camera body. If I am going to shoot in manual focus, I just do it on my lens because then there's only one switch I need to remember to switch back, not two. Personal experience, you do not always remember, so do check. I was shooting an event in Tokyo and it was going to be epic and I was so excited, shooting this strongman competition with this guy pulling this bus, and I switched to my wide angle lens and I took all the shots and I didn't chimp or anything because I knew my settings were solid, and my settings were solid, but none of my photos were in focus at the time and it felt wrong to ask the guy to pull the bus again. So I missed out on that and it was lame and I was very sad. So it absolutely happens to all of us. It was because I'd been shooting the Milky Way the night before and turned my autofocus off on that lens, and I was in a hurry and didn't notice it while I was shooting an event. So always check that first. With that, and I'm going to put these two kind of together as the viewfinder itself can also be calibrated. So if you've ever looked through your lens or through your viewfinder and you go, it's not very in focus compared to like what my pictures are coming out as, or like what I normally see when I look through something. What you can do is there's usually a dial right on the side of your viewfinder, either on the side of the viewfinder or kind of the side by the hot shoe, that you can actually calibrate. So you look through your viewfinder and you turn the little dial and you can make it so that it's adjusted to your eyes so that you can actually see everything clearly and in focus. If you've never messed with that, it's probably not set up exactly for your eyeballs. So that's something that you can check as well. Okay, next. The exposure triangle. Come on, you guys knew I was gonna go there because has there ever been a conversation about photography that did not bring up at least some part of the exposure triangle? There better not have been, because the exposure triangle is like the core of photography. If we're gonna talk about photography, we have to talk about if we're gonna talk about photography, we have to talk about the exposure triangle. That's like talking about cooking without having any ingredients, right? We're going to go through the exposure triangle and the way that each of the parts of the exposure triangle, the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO, affect our focus and our clarity of our shots, because every single one of those parts absolutely does. So Starting with shutter speed, there are 2 ways for shutter speed to mess up your photos, all right? So blur, motion blur, meaning that your subject is moving and your shutter speed was not fast enough to freeze them. Now, I'm gonna say as a rule of thumb, if you are shooting a subject that can breathe and blink and cough and move, try and stay at 1/100th of a second and higher. Now, if you are shooting a professional model who moves very slowly and can angle every shot for you and freeze until she hears the click, he or she or whatever, here's the click, cool, go lower than that. You do you, boo. But as a rule of thumb, especially if you're shooting like a family group where there's multiple people moving, 1/100th of a second or higher. And honestly, strong push on the or higher. Because when they're moving around, even if they don't blur a lot, that can create just a softness to your image, all right? So I would say if they're running around, especially like little kids, 1/500th of a second or up. Go up as much as you can, right? And if that means you need to add off-camera flash, I'm gonna do more videos about that so we can talk about that. But higher shutter speed so that you freeze your subject. Now remember how I said there's 2 things? So the subject is a problem, but you're also a problem too. So let's say I'm taking a picture of a flower and the flower is not moving and I am not moving, but it's not coming out totally crisp. Well, it could be that my shutter speed is still slow. Now, how could that happen, you say to Carrie, because I'm imagining that you're saying that right now. The thing is it's called shutter shake, right? If you have your shutter speed too slow to keep your camera stable when you're holding it up, and it's shaking around a little bit, especially if you're as energetic as I am or you drink as much coffee, there is a limit to where you can hand hold your camera. So in that case, I would probably use a tripod or adjust my settings so that it can be a faster shutter speed so I can hand hold. So a rule of thumb for that is no hand holding slower than 1/60th of a second, all right? I can talk, I promise. There's just a lot to say and I get excited. So with that, if you're gonna use a lens like this, that actually like telescopes out bigger than my head, 1/60th of a second is not gonna work in this situation, all right? So the rule with that, and honestly, it's one of those rules that I actually really like, is whatever the millimeter of your lens is your bottom shutter speed. So if this lens is, this one goes out to 500, right? So this is a 50 to 500 lens. It's an old Nikon lens that I love very, very much, but it weighs more than like a toddler. But if I'm shooting it all the way out like this and it's heavy, I am not shooting any slower than 1/500th of a second. And in all honesty, because it's so heavy and because it's so long, I'm probably closer to 1,000. Okay, so now this lens is a 24 to 70. That does not mean that I can get away with hand holding at 1/24th of a second, right? Like, that's not how this works. The limit is still 1/60th of a second, but honestly, I'm probably gonna shoot no slower than 1/70th of a second. Not, that's a number, but you understand what I'm saying. Because I want to make sure that I don't have any shutter shake and everything's really crisp. So honestly, I'd probably just round to 1/100th of a second for that lens. So 2 things with shutter speed. Your subjects can move and cause blur, motion, defocusing, okay? And you can move. So make sure that you keep your shutter speed fast enough to hand hold, if that's what you're doing, and make sure that it's fast enough to capture the subject if they're also moving. Okay, moving on to aperture. Okay. Aperture is a big one, you guys. I promise you, I am working on a video that's gonna dive really deep into aperture. I have one in my shooting manual mode, and I will put the link right there because I just learned how to do that so that you can look at the 10-part series of shooting manual mode. But what I want you to know is that aperture is a beast. All right, it covers and controls so much of your photography that I'm just gonna kind of glance over the top right now of the stuff that can affect your focus. So one of the biggest things that people do is they use too shallow of a depth of field. All right. Now I know. The trend right now, oh, I shoot at 1.4 and 1.8 and everything is blurry and everything has a nice bokeh. Cool. Everything is blurry. Everything is blurry because your depth of field at 1.4 or 1.8 is like this. It's very tiny. In fact, when you take like close-up shots of somebody and you walk up closer, your eyeball is in focus, but your nose and your ear is out of focus. Like that is how shallow those depths of fields are. In fact, if you look at this picture, I have an example of that. What I did with this picture is this is shot at 1.8 and my subject is very close to her background. And if we zoom in, you can see that her nose and her ear are out of focus. And the background is out of focus as well, but it's not like super blurry, right? It's not a big bokeh. Now this image was shot at 5.6 with the same setup. Like all I did was change my camera setting to 5.6. So she's still very close to the background, but if you actually zoom in, you see that more of her face is in focus, right? Like I can see some cheekbones and I can tell that she has hair that isn't just a blob. Not that it was a blob, you know what I mean. But you say to me, because once again, I'm going to give you a whole part of this conversation, the background isn't blurry. So here's the thing, you can absolutely get a blurry background with a higher aperture setting, like with a bigger depth of field. All you have to do is move your subject further away from said background because that's how depth of field works, right? They're focal planes and they're flat. So I'm just gonna step her further away from the background and take another picture at 5.6 and then one back at 1.8. Now, if you see these two images, both of them have a blurry background, but one of them she's much clearer in. Now, I'm not saying that she's not clear in the 1.8 because she wasn't moving and I'm a good photographer and I know how to make sure that her eye is in focus. But what I'm saying is that both have a nice blurry background and I have a lot more wiggle room in the 5.6. So if you're shooting a couple of people or a toddler or somebody that's moving and you want a little bit more wiggle room, then don't go with that like total 1.4, 2.8, like close down just a little bit and give yourself a little bit of room so that you can have a more in focus, crisp image, which is kind of what you said you were going for when you clicked, I want to watch this video. All right, so, all right, so I know that almost all of you have heard this whole like one number in your aperture per person in your picture, and that's a bunch of hogwash. I get what they're saying. What they're all they're trying to tell you is the higher the number in your aperture, the bigger the depth of field. Great, okay? So we know that because we studied our exposure triangle. But the whole like one person per number thing is complete hogwash. It does not work that way. I can take a picture of two people at 1.8 or 2.8 or whatever my lens goes to and have both of them be equally clear. And I can take a picture at 5.8 of a couple and have somebody completely out of focus because I didn't put them in the right positions, right? I didn't put them in the same focus plane. So while it's a good rule of thumb to remember that your depth of field gets bigger as the numbers on your F number gets bigger, it absolutely does not mean that if you have 20 people in a photo, you have to be at F20. That is not how this works, all right? So again, learn how to shoot in manual. Here's my starter guide 10 video series. I'm not even trying to advertise you guys. I just want you guys to understand this information. Okay, so depth of field, big reason that your photos are out of focus or blurry is that you didn't have a big enough depth of field when you shot that picture. If part of it is in focus and part of it is out of focus, that is probably what happened. Moving on to ISO. Okay, so ISO gets a bad rap. Everybody's like, oh my gosh, not a high ISO. And that's neither here nor there. My point is that if you do have a very high ISO, I'm talking very high ISO, then your images can look a little soft. They're not actually out of focus. They're just have more noise to them or grain, and it makes it look like they're softer. So a way to test this and to figure this out for your camera is go somewhere that it's fairly well lit, like, or at least a very or at least a very even light, and take a bunch of pictures and increase your ISO until you get to the point where on your screen or on your computer, you don't like how much grain is in that image. And that is your cutoff point for you as a professional when you're taking pictures. One caveat to that is it is worth it to get the shot and have noise in your photo. Then one caveat to that is it is better to get the shot with a noisy photo than not get the shot at all. So do not just stop shooting when you get to the point that you're a little noisy within reason. Okay, so recap exposure triangle. Shutter speed. There are two options. Either your subject was moving too fast for your shutter speed, or you were moving too much for your shutter speed. Aperture. Your depth of field wasn't big enough to keep enough of your subject in focus. And when you're shooting really wide open, that could mean that you just couldn't keep both their nose and their eyeball in focus at the same time. So if you shoot wide open, awesome, that's great. But get really good at using your lens because it is a big challenge to keep those photos crisp. And ISO, if you have a really, really high ISO, and I'm talking pretty considerably high ISO, it can make your images look soft. Little side note to that, if you zoom like crazy in on any photo, you're gonna get it, like it's gonna start to look soft and a little pixelated. And I will tell you that most people that want you to take their picture, most of the time are not gonna zoom in to like 700% like you're doing on Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever. So like, don't stress it if it looks soft at 700%. Like, it's okay, right? Like, calm down. If it's good at 100%, it's probably great. All right, now, let's say that you have gotten to the point where you've checked all those things. Okay, well, my autofocus is on, everything in my exposure triangle is good, my depth of field is awesome, but my photos are still not crisp or clear. Okay, that's totally an option that might happen. Here's some things that I would check for that. First off, have you updated your camera's firmware? Like, ever? Like, did you know that you could do that? Like, have you ever checked it at all? Like, since you ever bought the camera? My guess is a lot of you are saying no right now because it's not something that we commonly do, even though we absolutely should. Firmware updates don't come out that often. This isn't something that you need to do all the time, but they do come out. And if you've never done it on your camera, you probably have one. And it's very, 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 very easy to do. Just Google the make and model of your camera and type in firmware update after the name. So make, model, firmware update. Click enter, okay? Now, as long as you're going to the actual manufacturer sites so that it's a safe download, obviously, we gotta be safe on the internet. Download the firmware update and you just drag and drop that onto your SD card for most cameras. This is a setup for most cameras. Maybe yours is different, but most of them are like this. So drag and drop the firmware update onto the SD card, put the SD card back in the camera, and then somewhere in your menu settings, it should say firmware update. So click enter and it'll do its thing, and then poof, you are updated. It might mean that your menu settings change a little bit. Cool. It's all good. You just have to relearn it and figure out where everything is. It shouldn't change it that much, in all honesty. But it can help if you're having focus problems sometimes. Not always going to fix it, but if you've never updated it anyway, this isn't going to hurt anything. And then, last but not least, the one that is the most common that I hear everybody say whenever anybody on a Facebook group posts, oh my gosh, why is my photo blurry? Calibrate your lens. All right? So calibrating your lens is tedious. It's obnoxious. And it should probably be done every 3 or 4 months if you're very hands-on, like you use your lenses constantly. Basically, all you do is set this up. There's a little ruler here, and you take pictures of it and you make sure that your focus is pinpoint on the 0 for the ruler. Honestly, Google it, YouTube it. There's tons of videos out there. I'm not gonna get into that right now, but calibrating your lens is definitely a necessity, but not a constant necessity unless you're really, 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 really hard on your gear. I would say 3 or 4 months-ish. Maybe if you're constantly shooting and you're really rough on your gear, you could probably go longer than that if you don't shoot all that often. There was a point in time where I was shooting like 10,000 plus images a month and working 40 hours a week shooting. So at that point I had to take better care of my gear, but honestly, I haven't been shooting a whole lot here in 2020. And so I haven't been calibrating them as often. So calibrating your lens is great, but it is not the first problem, okay? Talk about those other things, mostly because if you are out on a shoot and you go, oh my gosh, everything's blurry, you don't just like say, oh, well, I guess the shoot's not gonna happen today, I'm gonna go home and calibrate your lens, right? You have to problem solve in the moment. That's part of the joy of shoots and shooting and being out with photography, is the problem solving and the figuring it out. At least that's what I love about it. So real quick review, make sure autofocus is on, make sure that you are using all 3 parts of the exposure triangle and understanding how that can affect your blur and your focus, and then make sure that your camera firmware and your lenses are all updated and calibrated, and that should cover most things. There's gonna be something I left out. There's gonna be a detail that somebody is thinking of right now. Go ahead and put it in the comments, just be nice, because we all like to play nice around here. Sometimes there really is a problem with your camera. Sometimes there really is a problem with your lens. But I'm gonna tell you right now, most of the time it's user error. This user especially, I mess up all the time, but I love learning. And so whenever I mess up, it's just a learning experience. And honestly, I like sharing and giving you guys that information so that maybe you don't have to go through that exact experience like I did. All right, you guys, that is the end of my video. I tried to make it short and sweet, but I know I talk a lot, I'm sorry. Go ahead and hit the like button, mostly just because I like it when you like. Go ahead and add a comment if you had any aha moments during this video, or if there's any videos you really want me to cover about this kind of stuff. And then if you haven't already, oh my gosh, please hit the subscribe and the notification bell, because there's videos every Tuesday. I am getting really good at this whole YouTube spiel thing, so I appreciate you guys giving me the click with the love on the bells and the buttons and the likes, all right? So click, 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 all the things, and then tell your friends about it, because why not? Have them join the party, right? So I can't wait to see you guys next week. We are doing a photo shoot next week. It's not just a talking head at a desk like it is this week, but hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you next week. Bye.